Hi, Shunatra.
I'll just start with giving a little introduction into today's chat. Hi everyone. Today being Women's Equality Day, and as a part of our Nyaaya Speaks conversation series for this month, we're talking to women from different spaces and organizations to learn about their efforts and experiences in demanding and realizing equality. Specifically for today's chat, we're going to be talking to Jasmine Pateja, who is an artist and founder of an organization called Blank Noise. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you, Shunatra. Delighted to be in conversation with you and Team Nyaaya.
Just to give a little bit information on Black Noise as well for our viewers. Black Noise is a community of Action Sheroes, heroes, Theyroes, citizens and individuals stepping in to end sexual and gender-based violence. They design projects and interventions to shift public consciousness to basically take ownership of these issues. Black Noise has been amongst the first collectives in India and globally to draw attention to street harassment and violence against women in public spaces. They have grown to work with victim blame, that's basically which is experienced by women across spaces of violence, not just in terms of street harassment. Black Noise is a part of an art practice, and we're going to learn more about them and their work today. So to hand over the floor to Jasmine, could you tell us a little bit of history into how Blank Noise started?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Shunatra. I'm just wanted to bring in that Blank Noise has been built by various people, thousands of people over the years, and some like a smaller core team of Action Sheroes who've often co-facilitated it since 2003. So we turned 17 this month, and I feel good about sharing this collective practice. In terms of how Blank Noise started, apologies for the sound coming from outside, didn't plan that. In terms of how Blank Noise started when I was in 2003, when I was in art school, when I was at Srishti, and I was new to Bangalore, and I was experiencing street harassment, not really knowing what to call it. I would be walking on the street and suddenly groped or stalked or once spat on. And I would bring in these experiences to my friends and peers, and would receive responses like, "It's not a big deal. It happens. Men are like this." I also started noticing that people around me, my friends and peers, had made this everyday reality invisible to them. Right? They went out only in groups, or they had a boyfriend, or there was some kind of safety protection mechanism that they had in, that they were carrying that was not visible to them. And I realized and recognized that my decisions were slightly different. I was walking on the streets, and I was interested in public spaces and walking, and excited about exploring this. So our relationships were different, and the invisibility of fear was stark visible to me at that time. And that was the climate or the situation within which Blank Noise was proposed. It was proposed as a graduation project at Srishti, and my interest was also in looking at how does art heal, how does art build a public conversation. So it came from, and it continues to be part of a practice called socially engaged practice. So this is sort of the backdrop to it. I also just wanted to add, I mean, it's not to say that, Bangalore's where I experienced street harassment and didn't experience it in Calcutta where I grew up. Of course it was there, but the idea of being on my own in a city, in a new city, just made that relationship of fear and defense with our own public spaces very, very visible to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's not localized to one city. Like, I grew up in Bombay. I spent some years in Delhi, and even though people say that Bombay is a relatively safer city, there have been many instances of street harassment that I faced, my colleagues faced, my friends faced. So to build on this point, like women, like as you mentioned, like a lot of people had normalized this kind of behavior, and women often wonder what degree of harassment is usually severe enough to go ahead and file a complaint with the police. Like as you said, like many of us are taught that it's okay, it's just casual eve teasing, you can just ignore it, that's not something to create a fuss about, it's just youthful indiscretion, which Like, it's categorized as a youthful indiscretion which the men on the street or boys on the street do. And from that, from the point that you started, as you said, they're going to complete 17 years now. And at that point, before all these crimes of stalking and sexual harassment that came to be explained much later in the law, how did you how did you go about defining what this street harassment or sexual harassment was? How did you convince women that this is something basically that it's wrong, you shouldn't normalize it and you should go ahead and complain about it? How did you do that basically?
Our focus was not always complaining or reporting at that time, but our focus at that time was to identify it, to understand it, to recognize it, to recognize something that we had been taught to normalize and invisibilize and dismiss as teasing, but it is harassment.
Yeah.
And the way that we could do it was through facilitating conversations. We've been designing several, over the 17 years now, we've designed several public and participatory projects to trigger discourse. So we remember back in 2004, 2005, I used to do something that I don't do anymore, but I used to photograph men who harassed me, and or I felt threatened by, and I would start posting those pictures on the internet, and that led to the blog, and that led to a lot of response, including what is street harassment, right? Like, is somebody asking you out for coffee when you don't consent to it, is that street harassment? Or is somebody groping very obviously, clearly street harassment? So those photographs, they became a provocation for dialogue. We had a blogathon that was proposed by one of our fellow Action Sheroes, Smita, and where she invited, and she and Raghu and lots of people 4-5 of us got together and asked various bloggers in the country to share testimonials of street harassment in 2006 on International Women's Day. And that led to hundreds of people writing in and speaking about street harassment, and sort of led to people remembering things that happened to them 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that they hadn't spoken about yet. So that blogathon was a very, very powerful moment for all of us. And street harassment was reported, the blogathon was reported in the mainstream media. It led to people across the country writing to us, Blank Noise chapters back then emerging. But those events and continuous events and testimonials aside, but we've always been building and finding ways to build testimonials of harassment. Like, we've got an archive of food names women have been called on the street, songs women have been called on the street, sung to on the street, other adjectives they've been described to. So we've been always finding ways and building ways and to start a dialogue in a way, in an environment where speaking about it was seen as even shameful in most situations. Like, I'm not that type of a woman. How can you ask me this question? Was one kind of response, besides being, don't make a big deal out of it. The other part was also that we had a lot of group discussions, consciousness raising processes where we would speak about a memory of being looked at in a certain way that we haven't forgotten. So we made this, it was called, in quotes, Eve teasing opinion poll, where strangers would come and put a thumbprint on what they considered harassment. And it included words like looking. And of course, it was met again with, should we not look? But we wanted to focus on not the verb, but the adjectives, or how are you, the adverb, the how are you looking, right? Not just where are you looking, but why is it that we haven't forgotten that gaze? That something made me feel sick inside, or not, I didn't welcome that gaze. So it may not be recognized by the law as offensive or non-offensive, but we wanted for people to make that uncomfortable memory or something that was sitting buried deep inside in memory. We wanted to make that visible and question our silence around it, or question the attitudes that normalized it.
So, as you put it, at that point of time, it wasn't something, looking was not something that was categorized as a sexual offense or sexual harassment. And it was only much later, interestingly, that when the 2013 criminal amendment came, that they said that it is the woman's experience that defines whether it's sexual harassment or not. So even if it's looking, though it came to be recognized much later, do you have any testimonies or stories that actually people came up to you and told you that, oh, because of these discussions that happen on your blogathon, on your physical spaces that you held these discussions, and they were sort of empowered to go ahead and complain about it? And did they approach you for say, or not just the complaining themselves, did they approach you for filing complaints or getting some help in this manner? How did you navigate
Right.
these conversations?
Right. One is that the conversations that were built and created made the issue much more visible. And there are instances of people having gone. One person that clearly comes to mind who saw that we had put up Section 350 for the IPC. We made these lithographic posters, put them around town, around Bangalore. So yeah, one of Action Sheroes reporting sexual harassment on the train, and really, but I remember very distinctly. She said, if I hadn't seen those posters, if we hadn't had these conversations, I wouldn't have gone ahead and done that. With regards, and also for her in terms of institutions facing a lot of blame around it, not blame, but there was a lot of dissuading, forgive him, you're ruining his life, he just did it once, he's going to have his exams. So there was very little that often, I don't recall her being encouraged at all to take that kind of action of reporting it. This is, I think, back in 2006 or 2007. In terms of people approaching us, we have been approached. We try and connect them to other resources. We currently don't have the capacity to connect, but what we are we currently don't have the capacity to support a person to the various institutions in terms of getting this kind of justice as defined by the law, but and other institutions and mechanisms. But what we would like to do is create more communication pieces around that become a kind of Action Sheroes guide to accessing.
Yeah.
But what we do is create community that recognizes this data, that makes it safe to process this, that makes it safe to process any kind of shame, blame, or guilt that we may have experienced, and yeah, to build capacity as Action Sheroes in that process.
Okay. So in the process, in the few cases that you actually did have get the opportunity to help out people in filing these complaints, did you face any institutional drawbacks or institutional hurdles, such as the police not recognizing it as street harassment, or any insensitivity on their part, refusing to file complaints? Did you come across many of these hurdles?
To answer that in sorry, yes, you were
No,
saying
I was just
something.
saying, and also can you elaborate how you dealt with them?
I feel like to elaborate and think about it in a way that feels right to me. I feel that we should have done a body of work in that department to respond. However, in the few instances that we were offering that kind of service, but also not service, but that kind of support, and we recognize things like the morality in police stations. I remember once going with somebody to complain about 3 a.m. prank calls coming in, and the police officer, she called up that number and said, I'm going to tell your parents. And that was the last time the person heard from those 3 a.m. boys. So the parents and morality, she didn't file a report at that time. Or the role of morality across these spaces, and victim blaming, or the good woman who can report, who can't report, becomes much more. Yeah, I'm also remembering another person, but I remember personally being asked, what does your mister do, by a police officer. So there were there was a some kind of mix of. But again, like I said, we need to do a body of work in terms of assisting and supporting somebody to cross that process to be able to answer accurately. Right now, it would be secondary information based on what we've witnessed. as all of us.
The reason I brought up this point is because a lot of people don't go ahead and complain thinking that the police is not going to go ahead and entertain their complaint. They might just think that, oh, it's a very trivial issue. Everyone around me is saying that, oh, it's all right. Like, it's just, so the man followed you. He didn't like come anywhere near you. So it's okay. I mean, that's not the kind, like that kind of attitude deters a lot of people from going ahead and complaining.
Absolutely.
So even, yeah, so to know that, okay, like, like being asked, like, what does your mister do? That's intimidating. Like, you go ahead to a police officer and you're trying to tell him, and then he's asking you all these different questions. But yeah, I mean, I completely understand. That's a whole different body of area where we need to have a conversation on what we can do to sensitize this process.
And given our interest and commitment to tackling and arresting attitudes of victim blame, it's definitely something we want to do. However, we haven't done enough that kind of engagement as yet. I mean, we have engaged with the police, but it's more of a start rather than something to reflect on and report. Yeah, and really across, from medical hospitals to police stations to courtrooms, victim blame plays a role across these institutions. But it's also this question of, I think what we do try and do is, if we're looking at public consciousness and the role of blame that resides, or victim blame as it resides in all of us too, as we internalize it. So we build our own capacity to recognize what we've internalized, and through community support overcome that, or start believing that we didn't ask for it, and owning that, and that becomes a first, or that, so it builds capacity to be able to go to that police station, or to be able to speak about it, or to be able to report it somewhere.
Yeah, that's very true. Also, I actually want to bring up the point that how my introduction to blank noise came to be was, I saw this T-shirt everyone was wearing on Instagram, the Akeli Avara Azad, and I immediately bought one for myself. And I started reading more about your campaigns on Akeli Avara Azad, I Never Asked for It, Meet to Sleep. Can you talk a little bit about these campaigns and the premise behind it? I understand that it's like, just very briefly, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's actually it's claiming public spaces for women and saying that it's not just a conduit to get somewhere, but also you have an equal right to be out in the public space. So can you talk about these campaigns and how you went about these issues?
I'm very tempted to say my response that day to the police officer who asked about the mister was, I said, "Sir, Akeli Avara Azad." So I just wanted to use it appropriately where needed. But let's go with Meet to Sleep first. It's sort of, with Meet to Sleep. Meet to Sleep as an idea, was dreamt of in 2007. All of us had sent in wishes that we had for our cities, for our public spaces. What's the one thing that I wish I could do in my city that I haven't done yet? And I'm usually facilitating events, but this time I decided to participate as well. And I wished to be able to sleep in a park. And a couple of months or maybe a year later, some of us went to Cubbon Park, Bangalore's Cubbon Park, and claimed or embodied some of those wishes. For instance, there was Action Sheroes Saraswati, who said, "I dared myself by sitting alone on a park bench and yawning and pouting and stretching." There was Action Sheroes Saumya, who sat under a tree and read a book. There was Action Shero me with Action Shero Srishti, and we decided to sleep. And we were all within, a line of view. But as I almost went into sleep, I would wake up. And again, I would almost go into sleep, and I would wake up and realize that sound, that threat that was so alive in me, was just a dog that went by. It was just a leaf that. And so at that moment, I kind of became very conscious of our story of fear, that there's the fear that we are carrying in our bodies, and the relationship between the perception of fear, the lived fear, and the actual attack, they vary a little bit. So it just made me realize that there are more of us, in fear of each other than with the actual intention to harm each other. And how do we make, interventions that are not based on defense, like the body in defense. Our bodies are always in defense in public spaces. We have our elbows out, we have a don't come near me death stare. Um, and and we've all been told, be careful, look out for, be careful of any stranger. So that moment of recognizing need to sleep was really in lying down, in imagining what would happen if there were more women just sleeping. What would happen in public spaces, what would happen to our bodies as we did that, what would happen to a public environment to have that. So it's really from that experience of extreme fear and wanting to be asleep, and the right, and our right to have not a fist but a state of defenselessness is our right, and to claim that as our birthright, to live in a state of defenselessness and trust rather than constant threat, fear, and caution is the Action Sheroes journey that we want to build, and is that right to our cities, our public spaces, or anywhere under the open sky, really, or even within closed doors at home, to live free from fear. So, need to sleep comes from that premise that we have a right to live free from fear, and it's currently built in collaboration with various individuals, communities, and organizations in rural and urban India, with networks like Kriya and Sangat. And it's speaking to women in different parts of the world, even. So if I'm hearing from somebody who's, let's say, is in New York and say, but I slept in Central Park before, but would you sleep at 2 a.m. in Central Park? If you can't, then let's have another conversation, because it's still negotiating right there. So that's really where need to sleep came from, that we have a right to live defenseless, to not be guarded, cautious all the time. And it's embodying what the I never ask for it mission is doing, and that, in my defenseless state, I'm not asking for it still.
I particularly find Meet to Sleep, the whole campaign, very fascinating, because I mean, even as I said earlier, I grew up in Bombay, and it's recognized as a relatively safe city. But every time I wanted to go out, I had to justify a reason to be out, and it was not recognized that, oh, public space is not somewhere like where a woman belongs. It's like you need to have a reason to go out, and you can't just be wandering around. But it was absolutely all right for a man to do that, or not have that. Like, so many of my friends, like, who are men, they didn't have deadlines in colleges, to go out and stuff. So that always came back to the point that, oh, we are only doing this to protect you. But again, you need to realize that we have an equal right to public spaces as anybody else. And which is why I said I find Meet to Sleep very fascinating, and I wish more cities do that more often, and just go out and sleep, just sit in a park bench. You don't have to justify it to anyone.
Yeah, after Meet to Sleep, a lot of women question that this was so simple. Why haven't I done this all?
Yeah.
Because I could sleep under a tree today. What stopped me all my life to do something as simple? Yeah.
So I actually just have one last question. This is in light of the COVID-19 context. So the government has basically announced now that everyone has to maintain social distancing and follow the 6 feet distance between everyone. While now you are talking about steps to take in public health crisis, a lot of women took a big sigh of relief, because this meant that they're going to have their own space in their bus, that no one's going to grope them, no, they're not going to be just haggled in a market or any crowded space, so do you think this is a good time to, what do you think about this views that are floating around on social media right now? And do you think this is actually a really good time to start a conversation on safety for women in public spaces? Like, how would you advise for someone to take this forward, take this conversation forward?
Yeah, I think it's always a good time to have a conversation on our claim to public spaces, and public spaces as that which is shared by multiple genders, sexualities, identities of persons, and how do we look at the public space as a shared space? So it's always a good time to have that conversation. And the bit around COVID and social distancing and the sigh of relief, it is temporary. You know, it is
Yeah.
the issue isn't gone just because there's social distancing right now. It creeps up in we're hearing of in a different context, sexual harassment at the workplace, where there is a different dynamic of viewing of harassing somebody by asking them to come on a video call. So just it leaks and finds itself in other spaces, in other forms. It's not just that the public space is, everything that happens in the public space happens in the public space. You and I are on the street, you and I are on a bus, you and I are in a party, you and I are at the workplace, you and I are at home. And how do we stay in our power across spaces? Same way, the person who is being abusive may be, the anonymity of a crowd may give license to behave a certain kind of way, but it will find that behavior or that intention is going to release itself in another form. So it's always, I mean, it's we need to see it as a it's not something that's going to disappear. It has not disappeared just because of COVID. The distancing, social distancing has disabled what can otherwise happen in close proximity and can be excused as just an accident very often. But having said that, this is about attitudes. This is about an abuse of power. This is about, and that will find new forms and behaviors. So so to answer your question, it's always a good time to talk about it. And also that with the sigh of relief, we need to see it as something that is current but not long term.
Yeah.
It is an intention that finds its release in other ways. It could be stalking, it could be something else.
No, that's very true. I mean, though you should see it as an opportunity to sensitize more people in this, but you should take any opportunity to go ahead and do this. But yeah.
Right. And I suppose it's making me curious now, like what forms is it taking now in social distancing? It's something we haven't asked, but I think our conversation is making me think of that. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's true that it's not absolutely going to stop. There is always going to be another platform where this is going to emerge on. But yeah, it's something to think about on how we can go ahead and take this conversation forward. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jasmine. And it was a very informative chat, and I'm sure many of our users have also found it to be very helpful. And I'm sure some may also be inspired after this chat to become more to go ahead and become Action Sheroes, Theyroes and Heroes ahead. So just to wrap up, we have more of these live chats coming up with more inspiring women from different spaces. Do check those out on our social media handles. We're going to be putting out information for these chats soon. And if you missed any parts of this chat, don't worry. We're going to be posting this video on IGTV and our YouTube channels. Thanks again, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely chatting with you. And thank you everyone for being there. Bye.
Bye-bye.